All right, thanks for joining us today. I am here with Josh Freezer of Freezer Legal, one of the initial NIL Verified companies, to discuss all things legal and NIL today. Josh, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Michelle. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. So I like to just start with the very basics. How did you get involved in the NIL space? And can you just share a little bit about your background leading up to, I guess, where we're at almost 2 years ago?
So my first introduction to the NIL space, very fortuitously, I was at the NCAA when California passed the first state NIL law. So I had the opportunity to be a part of some of the internal discussions in the law policy governance group about what for them was sort of the crisis response, but sort of taking a look at that and seeing as an association and the sports enterprise, college sports enterprise, what are we going to do about this? Because this is a really big change from that collegiate model that existed for 100 years. So, being able to be a part of that internal response team to some degree, even just to see some of the higher ups and their thoughts about this, was really beneficial for me. So that was sort of my first introduction to the NIL space. And then from there, I had another experience in law school where I was working for the National Sports Law Institute, where I got to research a little bit more extensively some of the state laws involved. At that point, obviously, none of them had gone into effect, but just sort of taking a look at everything that was potentially in play and all the different language and everything we had sort of differing state to state. And then when I graduated from law school was about a month or two before NIL went into effect. And I thought, wow, this is a really great time to get involved in a market that doesn't have a lot of track record, and there aren't a ton of folks with a lot of experience in this. And I think this is a really good opportunity for me to sort of establish myself as an expert in this space sort of quickly, as compared to some other areas of law where maybe people have 10, 20, 30 years of experience in dealing with it. Because it was so new, it was a really good opportunity for me to get involved.
Yeah, and it's interesting on the state NIL laws. If you were studying that in the spring of 2021, they just kept coming. It seemed like every week that there was a new one that was either being proposed or getting passed. And yeah, it was such a fascinating time, I think, that spring.
Right, absolutely. And even the year preceding that too, I think we had a lot from the time that California passed its law, and then Florida passed, and Colorado passed, and the dominoes just sort of fell, and then changed again. And it's not all that different from what we have today, where once a month we're getting some proposed legislation or past legislation that's different than it had been, or changed for a second time. It's really dynamic from the state legislative perspective.
Yeah, and I think I actually pulled together kind of a graphic looking at all of the NIL state laws that had been either amended, repealed, something had happened to them since they were passed initially. And we're at a couple dozen already in less than 2 years.
Right. Certainly, there's a lot more happening from the legislative perspective in the NIL space than there are in a lot of other areas of law that maybe don't change for, once, but every 20 years or 30 years or more.
College sports rule our country. So now that NIL has, we're coming up on 2 years here in a month and a half or so. What do you think has gone well, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the opportunities that are available for student athletes is really the biggest thing, right? I think student athletes have had so many opportunities to get involved in the NIL space, but also get a little bit more experience with the business side of it. Where athletes are brands now, they're businesses sort of on their own. So they've had the opportunity to work with agents, work with attorneys, work with all kinds of branding professionals, other professionals. And I think that college athletes have gotten such tremendous world experience and business experience from this. And I think to me, that's the biggest takeaway, is not just the money that has come with being able to exploit NIL that was not previously available to them. I think to me, the biggest benefit is the real world business experience that so many student athletes have, that they wouldn't have had before.
Yeah, I love that piece of NIL as well, the professional development and creating kind of a network that they can take with them after they graduate. It's such a really, really cool piece of NIL, and I really feel like we're just scratching the surface of what this will look like. What would you say is the most surprising piece that has evolved over this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that have been surprising. I think it was sort of anyone's best guess on July 1st, 2021, where this would sort of all go. But to me, for my chair, I think the biggest surprise is that there hasn't been more enforcement from the NCAA. coming after the Alston decision, I think the NCAA feels as though it's sort of on, uncertain antitrust ground from the enforcement perspective. But I would have expected some level of enforcement beyond what we've gotten so far. I mean, we have one, very minor case that doesn't even really center on NIL with the University of Miami. And beyond that, there's been no enforcement from the NCAA. So, is that coming in the pipeline? Perhaps things do take time. The NCAA infractions process is notoriously very, very slow. But, I think I'm really surprised to see very, very low levels of enforcement to this point.
Do you think it potentially is a bit delayed because of Emmert leaving and Charlie Baker coming in and potentially just saying we're going to wait and hold on this until we get new leadership and figure that piece out?
No, I don't think so. I think the NCAA president has no real role in the enforcement and infractions process. And I know even from, sort of firsthand experience when I was there at the Office of the Committees on Infractions, anytime we'd get a university president or public actor sort of calling for the NCAA president to get involved, the NCAA president, who was then Mark Emmert, always said, nope, I have no role in this process. It's a peer review process. Go through the formal, channels that how this exists. And it's not my role and responsibility. At least that's always been the public response. Behind closed doors, it's sort of anyone's guess.
And I'm curious too, now that we're on this line of topic, I know that the NCAA had a job listing for kind of a NIL enforcement type position. Gosh, I want to say that was almost a year ago now. I mean, between 6 months and a year, probably. Do they ever hire for that?
I do believe that they did hire a development director for any enforcement staff for NIL. Gotcha. So, my understanding of that position is it's probably going to be a little bit more based on sort of building relationships with some of the stakeholders sort of across the board so that person can be as in the know as possible. I'm not sure how much actual investigating they're going to be doing. That may be some other position in the enforcement staff, but I do think that role was filled as far as I know. Interesting.
Yeah, I haven't even heard anything about it, but I'm like, man, that was a while ago and I haven't really thought about it, but they have to have hired by now, but very interesting. So what would you say, I mean, looking at all the different stakeholders around this industry, right? We have athletes, we have the brands and businesses, the administrators and coaches within the athletic department, and then this whole kind of ecosystem of service providers and different businesses working within the industry. What do you imagine are the biggest challenges currently facing? Let's start with our athletes that are navigating the NIL space.
I think the biggest challenge for anyone in this industry, perhaps except for the industry ecosystem that sort of exists peripheral to NIL, I think is keeping up with all the different state legislation and, the really dynamic, rapidly changing environment that we have. And I know for a lot of student athletes, it can be confusing, right? You don't have a ton of time to look through different legislation and consult with different folks about what can I do and what can I do. And then it changes and then it changes again. And, maybe it changed in the state where you go to school, but it didn't change in the state where you're from. And I think it can be really challenging sometimes if you don't live this and breathe this every single day to sort of understand what can I do, what can't I do. And I think the challenge for student athletes in particular is what happens for a lot of them is they say, you know what, I'm just not going to get involved at all because I'm not sure. And I don't want to do anything wrong. And I don't want to mess up because there's a lot on the line here, right? It's not just about them making money. It's not just about their long-term intellectual property. It's about their ability to continue to compete as a student athlete and get an education too, which is, of course, sort of the most important thing for most college athletes, across the board. So I think keeping up with the really dynamic and ever-changing environment is a really big challenge for everybody.
Yeah. And I think that, it's a big mindset shift as well of like, for athletes going, oh, I can go and do all these things now that ever since, they've started playing sports at a high level have been, once you get to college, you cannot do any of this stuff until you move on. And then also at the local level with the businesses and restaurants that have been told for decades, don't give the kid a soda with his meal because you could cost him his eligibility as an impermissible benefit. And now, they're hearing all this NIL stuff and going, wait, we can do what? And like, what does that look like? What does it mean for our state, for the school that's near us? What's the NCAA policy? So I think you're spot on. There's just a lot of hesitancy and quite a bit of friction. So a lot are just holding back and going, you know what, it's just better for me to sit this one out for now.
Right, exactly. And just keeping up with that because it's, let's say you're even a restaurant chain with a restaurant in Indiana and another restaurant in Illinois, or let's say you've got a few between different states. I mean, keeping up with all of that and saying, okay, we can do this in this state, but we can't do this in this state. And we've got to keep track of all of this. I think that's a really big challenge for folks who maybe don't have the time or capacity to keep up with all of that. It's easy for you and I, we do this every day. It's easy for us to keep up with it. But I think for a lot of folks who are stakeholders in this industry, it's challenging to find the time to keep up with all the different state laws and how they've changed and what's permissible and what's not, sort of between you're talking, I always say we've got 3 compliance checks for every NIL deal. It's your institution, your state, and the NCAA rules. But, we're talking about a business that, maybe it's a local chain of restaurants or whatever it is, they've got to keep up with all of that different stuff. That's challenging, right?
I think it's challenging for me to keep up with all of it. And you're right that I'm doing this all day, every day, and on the weekends. Shoot.
Right.
Oh, I would say, I mean, just from my experience from working at San Diego State, that another kind of big challenge that I saw from the athletes there was always kind of this hesitancy or question marks around the contracts that they're being asked to sign into. And of course, myself, without the legal background, have to say, hey, you really need to get an attorney, if you have a family friend, somebody that can help you to actually read and vet through this. But can you share a little bit about what are the most commonly negotiated terms in a marketing representation contract?
Right. So, yeah, I think that's another really interesting piece of this is that student athletes are now working with marketing agents, which is completely different than anything we've ever seen before. And I think there's a really interesting distinction between marketing agents and sports agents. We traditionally think about sports agents who negotiate professional playing contracts. If you're going to go and play in the NBA or the NFL or any sports league, you're going to hire an agent to help you get a deal with the team or help you get drafted. And this is completely different in a lot of senses, even though they're regulated in a somewhat similar way, although to a much lesser extent. There's much less oversight and regulation, but some of the state laws that we have regulating sports agents are exactly the same for professional sports agents and for marketing agents, even though they do completely different things and really don't overlap at all, other than the fact that they're both working for athletes and that's sort of it. But yeah, I think if you're looking at working with a marketing agent, the things that I would really focus on are exclusivity clauses, commission clauses, and termination clauses. And the first one, exclusivity, I think in a marketing representation agreement, a really big question is if the deal is coming from someone other than the marketing agent, is the marketing agent still going to take a commission on that? Because a lot of deals, as we know, go through social media. Someone reaches out to you via DM. Does the agent still get to take a commission on that deal, even though they didn't do anything related to the deal? That's something I'd always look for. Mm-hmm. Something else is the commission rate. In professional sports playing contracts, that's specified by a collective bargaining agreement, whether it's a limited percentage, 2% to 4%, depending on the league, right? There's some hard numbers we have to work with. Here, we have nothing. So, you've seen some marketing agents that will take 10%. I've seen some asking for 50%. That's a really big range and can make a huge difference to college athletes. And the last thing is termination clauses. So I'd always look at termination clauses to see, well, if you're not happy with these services, can you get out of this representation agreement? Can you find someone else to represent you? And if you can't easily terminate the agreement, or you have to terminate the agreement and then you owe them everything for a year after that, that's something I'd really keep in mind because it can play a huge factor.
Yeah, those are awesome. And I think that those are also, obviously they have nuances, but they're simple enough for athletes to try to locate and find in those contracts. And I know just from even looking at a couple with the San Diego State athletes that those, especially the termination clause isn't always in there and it's not always that clear. And with the exclusivity as well of whether, it's simplified and so not spelled out in a way that it's clear on either side, or it's saying we're going to be taking commission from deals sourced by us or by the athlete. And then you're going, well, how many athletes are they signing, onto their agency, and are they being active to go out and source these opportunities? Because I've heard some agents are just signing into exclusive contracts. They're sitting back and going, oh, you got a deal? All right, here's my 20, 30% or whatnot. It's a crazy world.
Yes, it absolutely is. And, for like we talked about earlier, the difference between professional sports agents and marketing agents is there's not really much regulation here. Really all we have is some very basic state laws that have to deal with, the Uniform Athlete Agent Act sort of generally across the board, but there's no regulation beyond that, right? For professional athletes, they have unions who say, we're going to specify these X, Y, and Z things. And in order to represent our players, you need to meet this criteria and you need to do this and you need to do that. Here, we don't have that. College athletes don't have a union yet, or maybe ever. But, at this point, there's no regulation of this. So, it really is up to the athlete on their own to make sure that the deal is good.
And I think, yeah, and I think that a lot of times people lose sight of how young these athletes are as well. They are, I remember, at San Diego State, I got a freshly turned 18-year-old. He turned 18 that day and he brought me, a representation contract. Now his father also gave me a call and said, hey, let me know, like, I want to help out with this as well. But they are so bigger than life when you watch in the stadiums and in these full arenas, that it's like, no, they are 18 to 22-year-olds who are still, brains are still developing, and they definitely don't have the experience to be navigating all of this and all the nuances of contracts that lawyers like yourself go to school for many years to learn all the ins and outs of all these things. So scary a little bit.
Absolutely. And, there's a really big contrast in parent involvement too, because, you're talking about an 18-year-old, and I know this from my perspective, plenty of times it's the parents that reach out to me and say, hey, we want you to look at this contract. And I think that's always good when that happens, but not every student athlete has a parent that's going to be super involved or super interested in any of this. So, I think for student athletes that maybe don't have a parent that's going to, really make sure that the contracts are in order, or they're talking to attorneys or talking to folks they can trust. You've got to find people that you can trust who can support you and make sure that you're making those decisions appropriately.
Yeah. Well, good stuff. So other than those few clauses, if an athlete, before they sign in with, either a marketing agency or a collective or whatnot, like what are some other things that they should be paying attention to or looking for?
Absolutely. I think for NIL deals in general, or NIL world in general, you're really going to be concerned about the dollars and cents of it all. But to me, from my perspective, the biggest concern for NIL should be long-term intellectual property rights across the board. Especially if you're working with an agency or working with a collective, I'd really be concerned about anything that gives that agency or that collective long-term intellectual property rights to the student athletes NIL. Anything that says in perpetuity, royalty-free, non-revocable, anything like that, I'd really read closely and ask questions to make sure you understand what it is that you're signing, what you're giving them. Because you don't want to be in a position where you've taken an NIL deal for $200 as a freshman in college, and then 4 or 5 years later, when you're a professional, that agency or that collective or whoever it is turns around and says, hey, you gave us these rights. We can do this and we don't need to pay you for it now that you're a first round pick or whatever the case may be. So I think anything long-term intellectual property concern, you should really read closely and make sure you understand what it is that you're giving up.
So many things I got to pay attention to. Kind of an interesting trend that I thought was going to progress last year, which kind of got shut down by the additional guidance by the NCAA they put out in October, that essentially was saying that they didn't want institutions to be really providing NIL type services specifically available for athletes. And it seemed to be kind of towards, I don't know, tax support, but also law clinics and legal support. Now, the trend that I saw before that was popping up were some schools were partnering with or some athletic departments were partnering with their law schools to pop up these NIL law clinics where current law students would, work with the athlete, read through the contract, get that real life experience, and the athlete also would then have access to this kind of support. Do you see that coming back, or do you think that was the right move and direction, or where do you think that's really going to go?
Yeah, I think it was a good idea when a lot of those popped up. And the reason that I think they were a good idea, sort of, big picture at the surface level, I think they were a good idea because a lot of NIL deals are not for a quantity of money that you're going to go out and work with an attorney, right? Attorneys are understandably a little expensive sometimes. And if you're signing a contract for $100 or free merchandise, you're probably not going to go hire an attorney and pay them hundreds of dollars to review that contract or put together a contract. The flip side of that coin, and I think this is maybe why some of the universities got a little cautious with this, and the NCAA said maybe this isn't the best route forward, was from the liability perspective. Universities and their representatives are always going to have the fiduciary obligation to the university and not to the student athlete. So while the clinics can be beneficial, I think, sort of from, again, big picture, I think the challenge there is that these folks, they don't necessarily have the student athlete's best interest as an obligation, because at the end of the day, they either work for the university because they're law professors, or if they're students at the university, there's some, sort of mixed obligations. And as lawyers in general, we always owe the client the duty of loyalty and duty of responsibility. So, I think it can be really challenging when you sort of split up those obligations between the university and the student athlete, and you're not necessarily working towards the student athlete's best interest when you've got this other obligation there, and that's the responsibility to the university.
Is there that same kind of conflict that you'd say with other law clinics? Because I know, like, for example, at USC, we were trying to get a soft partnership in place, with USC Law Clinic, and they were potentially going to fold them into their entrepreneurship law clinic where, just for the NIL contracts. But is there that same conflict there, or not really, would you say?
So it sort of depends on what the interest is, but I think anytime you've got a law clinic that works with either undergraduate students or grad students that are currently students of that university, there's always that potential for conflict of interest. It sort of depends on the finer details of who's providing the legal support and sort of all those finer details. But generally, I think that's something that can always pop up.
Gotcha. Moving on here to future of NIL. So we know new NCAA president, Charlie Baker, has made NIL kind of one of his main goals to kind of wrangle in this first year, 2 years. And he's really pushing for a federal NIL bill. Is that something that you think is on the horizon that would pass? And do you think it's good or bad for athletes, for the industry, for everyone kind of around the space?
It's anyone's guess as whether or not it's actually going to get passed. I think it's going to face a lot of hurdles, and I think we're a really far way away from actually seeing that. The question about whether or not it's a positive or a negative for athletes and for the industry in general, I think there's pros and cons to it. And a lot of the folks who are anti-federal legislation say, it is fine how it is now. We like it how it is now. A lot of those folks see federal legislation as the only thing that can happen is it will take away rights from athletes. And they don't want to see that happen. And I think that's really understandable. And I think that's a really fair perspective. But to me, there's a really big trade-off there where we've got a huge positive. And the huge positive is having some certainty in all of this. And again, going back to your point about it's easier, for us to keep up with this. We live this, we breathe this, we do this every day. But for college athletes, I think it would be a lot easier for them. And this is from some feedback from clients and from some other folks that I've talked to. I think it would be much easier for them if we had one uniform standard, a federal law. We didn't have to look at different state laws. We didn't have states trying to change it every other month. And we can say, these are the rules on NIL. It's clear. This is what it is. To me, that's a really big benefit. And I think that's going to encourage more student athletes who have maybe been hesitant to get involved in NIL to say, you know what, I feel comfortable now. This is the law. It's uniform across the board. Everyone can do the same thing. I know what I can do here. And this is what we can do going forward. To me, that's positive, and maybe is even worth the trade-off of potentially some limitations on what student athletes can and cannot do. For the industry in general, I think that's a benefit. We talked about earlier some of the businesses that have maybe been hesitant to get involved because they say, well, we're not sure if we can do this, or maybe we could do it here, but we can't do it here. I think that's a benefit too, where we can say across the board, these are the standards. They're very clear. Everyone knows these are the rules now. I think that's going to encourage more businesses to say, we feel comfortable getting involved here. And there's less risk and less liability than if we're dealing with different state laws that can change from time to time.
Yeah, I totally agree with the business and brand side that if they can be more confident in the space, that they will more likely to engage, and that just grows the whole market and
Exactly.
industry. And versus, I think a lot of, I mean, local, maybe regional or even national businesses, of course, the worst PR that they could get is if they somehow inadvertently cost an athlete their eligibility. I mean, we haven't seen that yet, but I think that's all in the back of their heads just because of what they've been told for the last couple of decades. And so if they actually had a set uniform like rules, then potentially be more confident and actually get in the game, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing that's probably keeping plenty of businesses from starting to do NIL deals that haven't yet is the fear of, what about that bad PR? What if we get the school in the infractions program? What if a student athlete is ineligible because of us? I mean, there is no worse PR than that. That's a national story. I mean, that absolutely will outweigh any positives of doing any deals. And I think that's a real fear to sort of keep up with all the laws, do it in a compliant way. And, maybe it's not worth the risk for a lot of them. I'm sure that's the case.
Yeah. All right. Last question here. If you could give one kind of piece of advice or a thing that you wish the athletes would be more aware of as they start just navigating the space and exploring NIL and different opportunities.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I think student athletes should be aware of when they're navigating NIL in general is it's not just about that one deal. It's not just about the dollars that you're going to get or the Instagram story that you're going to post. I really think it is a big picture thing. You have to think big picture, long term. What am I tying up in this partnership? What exclusivity clauses are there in there where if I work with this company, I can't work with other competitors in that industry? What long-term rights and abilities am I giving to them for 5 years down the line when I'm a professional? I think to me, that is the biggest thing that you have to keep in mind. It's not just X number of dollars in exchange for a public appearance or a social media post. It is really, there's a lot more to it. So think big picture.
Awesome. Yep. I totally agree with you on that spot. Awesome. So if you want to share, just where can people find you? Freezer Legal, either on socials and website and all that good stuff.
Yeah, the easiest way to find Freezer Legal is at freezerlegal.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Twitter, or just give it a good old Google search. You should be able to find us. FRIESER.
Awesome. And I will throw a little brag in for Josh here. He writes great content for people in the industry, for athletes who are navigating this space. If you're running camps, there's some great blog articles up on his website that really cover a lot of different pieces within the industry. So I definitely recommend checking it out and reading some of those pieces.
I definitely try to put as much out there that's going to be beneficial to student athletes, to businesses that are interested in getting into this space, because there really is a lot to cover here. So I do my best on that. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining today, Josh, and we will talk soon.
Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate you having me on.